There you go.
Welcome, everyone, particularly on this day. As people often say, we realize you had other choices today. Let me start by asking how many people have no experience with mindfulness practice at all? Wow. Okay, thank you. Not what I expected, but good. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is the joining of mindfulness and action. And we'll do a short guided meditation or mindfulness practice. You'll find I use the words mindfulness and meditation interchangeably. For 40 years it was called meditation. Now mindfulness has become a big brand name, so I'm never sure exactly what to say, but anything that begins with an M, this is what I'm talking about. So let me address people who have a little experience, but it's not going to be difficult for those of you who don't to understand. Just at the beginning, and then we'll go through the instructions. When you're drawn to a mindfulness or meditation practice and you begin to engage it, often what leads many of us there is a sense of needing some further perspective, being overwhelmed or having difficulty in handling something or other. Otherwise, there'd be no reason to look into sitting still and doing nothing, which is, in our culture, a rather bizarre thing to do. And when you begin to engage the practice, you start to see, in fact, how jumpy and unmoored and all over the place your mind is. And often beginning meditators, there's a very common problem that people who begin meditation report. They say, I think that since I started practicing mindfulness, my mind has so many more thoughts in it. Instead of being less kind of jumpy, my mind's much more jumpy. And, after one said this themselves and heard 1,000 other people say it, you kind of laugh, because really what's happening is sitting and doing nothing, which is essentially what meditation practice is. There's certain guidelines, but really what you're doing is sitting with some hope/trust that there's a native intelligence that you have, native capability, that this is going to uncover. And what you see is really all the ways in which you're at corners and at odds with yourself. You begin to, because you're doing nothing, your mind has nothing to occupy itself with, so you begin to see how it works. It's very interesting. It's fascinating. It's horrifying. And if you stick with it, it is also incredibly relaxing. That you begin to discover that every now and then, for no particular reason, there's a glimpse of a much more settled, open, and joyful state that comes along. We can't force that. And so that's those little glimpses that, along with our speediness and lack of clarity, there's also the other side that's possible in us. That's often what keeps those of us who stick with this practice going. And as we do so, we also begin to notice that it begins to bleed into daily life. You may find yourself a little bit less reactive. You may begin to notice a little bit more. At the same time, many of us quite reasonably approach the practice of mindfulness as a timeout from the pressure of our lives, a timeout from challenges. And if you would push it further, you might say that many people become, without really realizing it, take on meditation as an escape. So there's a sense that here's a kind of space where I can somewhat relax, where I'm not hassled, where I'm not pressured, where I can get some clarity. And then I've got to do that to counteract that craziness that's going on in my life otherwise. In the great meditation traditions, which is what mindfulness is based on, they don't talk about escape at all. The point of meditation, at any level that you want to take it, is really to learn how to engage differently. Learn how to engage more beneficially for yourself and for others. Learn how to engage more effectively, more honestly, more genuinely, more powerfully. So there isn't a notion of meditation being something apart from one's life, fundamentally speaking. Practically speaking, it's very good to set aside times, even to go and maybe do a week or 2 weeks of it if you're serious about it. But that's always with the idea that this is going to help you engage your life. So basically what we're talking about is how to act wisely, how to inform action with clarity and insight, or how to bring the insights we have into acting. And if you're in a helping profession, or you're working to make some kind of positive change, you need both. You need to be skilled in both insight and acting and how to marry them. So the basic advice often that's given in mindfulness teaching about action is try to be present, try to be aware. We're going to go a bit beyond that and suggest there's other aspects of the basic mindfulness practice you can look at and recognize that will help you in how you act. And what I'm drawing this from is the Buddhist and Shambhala traditions, and also my own life experience and that of others who've taught this with me, study and teaching of leadership. So whatever makes sense here, please take it, forget the rest. And this is not coming out of any great doctrinal tradition. So you can blame me for anything that doesn't make sense. But I'm going to offer you a lot and listen for what you can use. And hopefully there will be some things in here that will be useful. So we're going to start with meditation, a few minutes of practice. So for those of you who have done this before, you'll probably find this quite familiar, although, as they say, it's fresh every time. And for those of you who haven't, I'm going to give you the basic.
Okay.
Okay, good. I thought it told me to slow down, which often is a good signal for me. I'm going to give you the full basic instructions, so you can take this from here and do it at home, do it with a group, but you'll have the whole story. And as I said at the beginning, the viewpoint behind doing this practice is a little different than we might expect, because meditation practice these days, or mindfulness, often comes along with yoga, going to the gym, working on my self-development. It's part of that whole bundle, culturally speaking. But in fact, the idea of meditation really is to try to train yourself to do nothing. You're not really, as you sit there, trying to improve yourself or trying to enhance any particular quality. So this is why I said there's a understanding here that we as human beings are basically and fundamentally thoroughly capable and thoroughly equipped to live in this life fully and powerfully and joyfully. And that quality is often referred to as basic goodness. So what we're trying to do is just sit with our basic goodness and not try to adjust anything. Now, that's very difficult to do. If I asked you to sit here and do nothing, just nothing. I mean, I could do it. We don't really have time to play too many games here. But you would find that not so easy to do. As a matter of fact, impossible. So the meditation traditions offer a very simple way of bringing yourself back into the present moment. And there are different traditions. In this case, it's following your breath. And not trying to breathe in a particular way, nothing to do with yoga, breathing whatever way you normally breathe, but just paying attention. Because breath is something that really is happening now in the moment. It's not a story you're telling yourself. It's not a distraction. It's a simple physical activity. And we're trying in mindfulness to simply ground ourselves, simply be there. So, first important thing is posture. So I'll ask you to sit. It's not so easy with the chairs, but as much as you can, sit straight. And the important thing here is that your spine is erect. And reason for that is that psychologically speaking, it's the feeling of not leaning on anything. If you're back in the chair, you may feel more relaxed, but actually it's putting your awareness is half asleep. So this notion of being upright, not leaning to one side or the other, not leaning on anything for support, and feeling your butt in the seat firmly. There's always this quality of being on the earth. We're not escaping anywhere. We're feeling the gravity. We're in this room. We're here. So anything and everything will come up in your mind. And we're not trying to not think. Very important. Meditation is not about stopping your thoughts. Actually, I have to say the famous word that everyone has to use these days, neurologically speaking. You can't do it. What you can do is repress your thoughts or self-hypnotize yourself. And unfortunately, many people mistake that for meditation. It's just becoming blank and dumb when you do that. It's not stopping your thoughts, it's not being hooked by them. And what happens is we're continually hooked by reactions, by what people say to us that triggers something else and then we're gone, by things that remind us of something, by old stories that we tell ourselves, old battles we fight with ourselves all our lives. These things all rumble around like in the big attic, as if there's no adult supervision. And we get hooked. So what we're trying to do in meditation is simply notice how our mind is. Just notice. The reason just noticing is actually the best thing we can do is when we just notice we're in that moment, we can't be hooked. It's when we're not seeing what's going on in us that we're under the sway. Okay? So, the practice now is to feel your body as much as possible. You may have aches and pains, that's fine. Anything that comes up in the next few minutes is regarded as something that you notice and come back to the breath. Pain in your leg, feeling of sadness, feeling of what the hell is this guy talking about, feeling of I wish I should have gotten a coffee before I came up here. I was lucky somebody offered me this. All of those things we just regard as thinking process. And then just bring the attention back to feeling the breath. Now, the breath is coming and going, and what I'd like to ask you to do is, as you feel the breath go out, try to pay attention to it. And then it goes out and it just vanishes, it dissolves. And so there's a kind of just openness, nothing particularly going on. Breath comes in by itself, you don't have to do anything. And then when it goes out again, touch it with your attention. Let's try that for a couple of minutes, and then we'll go further. Settle yourself. And bring your attention to your breath as it goes in. The attention on the breath should be light, a light touch. We're not trying to concentrate hard. But the breath is there anyway. And it's just a feeling of it which brings us back into the moment, into the body, lets us see a little bit more what's going on. And there's people walking outside, curious about what's going on. Sun is shining here. Let all that be there. You don't have to shut it down. Just don't get hooked by it. Hooked means wondering, wonder what they think we're doing. Or I should be outside. Back to the breath. Okay. Questions from anybody who's heard this for the first time? Please don't be shy.
So all these thoughts that are coming to the forefront,
Yes.
are we supposed to just let them ramble around, or are we supposed to focus on one? Or because it's hard to do, oh, this one's really important, I have to focus on this one. Or are we just supposed to let them go?
Yeah, great question. So, yes, let them go. But in order to do that, you need to see them first. You can't actually let them go unless you contact. So you notice the thought. It's sort of like, let's say you are digging a well, and somebody comes by the property and they wave to you. They say hi. You look up and you notice they've got a red jacket and a goatee and a braid that's sort of off to the side. And you'll take that in a glance. You know who it is. You say hello, but you go right back. You don't break your rhythm. So it's that quality of, yes, definitely let them go. What you don't do is you climb out and get into a conversation with them, and then you remember half an hour later, oh, I was supposed to be doing
So that's in that little exercise, I would have to say to myself, that's going to have to be a learning experience.
It is.
Because I would say, oh, I like your red hat. Where did you get that?
Of course. That's exactly what we all do.
You have to train yourself to.
Yes. Yes. That's.
Take it in.
Yes. It's training. And we're going to talk later about how that's training for everything in life. That's not just training for sitting and meditating. That's the power of it, is that we're constantly in the same situation in work, in relationships, where we're hooked by thoughts. In that case, we don't even know it because we're not paying attention. And it's very difficult to know how to have a thought come up and then let it go. There's a very good advice, which may make sense or not, but it does dawn on one as you practice, which is don't believe your thoughts. You don't have to believe your thoughts. See, recognizing that thoughts are just thoughts. They're just, here we are sitting here in this room, and anything can come up in our head. Anything. We don't have to sort of make a story of it. So yeah, it's definitely training. And it's training based on beginning to see that that would be a pretty good thing, not to get hooked by one's own thoughts.
So it's giving up control? Yes,
it's giving up control. But that sounds quite scary. It is scary, but you do it in stages. So there's a whole, graduated approach to it. So you can give up as much control as you can give up, and then you learn more and more. And of course, the other thing to say about meditation is I hate to say this in a way, but it is like riding a bicycle.
Like what?
Riding a bicycle. It's a kind of, because you're working internally, so it's a kind of feeling that's a bit hard to put in words of how to relate with your thoughts, but you get it with practice. Let's try again for a few minutes. And again, for people who are new, I'm going to suggest one further thing that you can do. If you find yourself really drifting away and stop, you can say to yourself, just subconsciously thinking, just to sort of remember that you're not actually in this drama that's unfolding in your mind. It's just a thought. And as you say, thinking, that can be helpful to come back to the breath. So let's do this again just for a minute or two. And this posture is a natural human posture. It has a certain kind of elegance and dignity to it. It's really the posture of, it's almost like a royal posture. You see someone sitting in a throne, there's a sense of confidence and kind of being worthy of being in that particular position. So, there's not a kind of slump, but there's a sense of, okay, I'm here and I'm ready to engage. And we may feel very shaky and trembling and off, but there's a lot of power in posture. If you try it yourself on days when you don't really feel like standing up straight, watch your mind. There's a very powerful connection between mind and body. So you could always check into your posture. Are you holding yourself upright, or are you beginning to sort of tilt one way or the other? And the practice is simply coming back again and again. When you realize you've drifted off somewhere, just coming back to the breath, coming back to being here, sitting. It's not about achieving any particular state. It's the practice of coming back. And the states or the insights take care of themselves. Okay, because time is short and we have a lot to cover, and we'll stop there with the practice. Feel free to ask me questions as we go through this. Now, what I'm going to talk about going forward from here, I'm going to talk about both in terms of meditation practice and action, but I think it will be accessible for those of you who are new to this, because we're really just talking about our own experience. So often when we talk about meditation practice, what are the qualities of practice? We can talk about things like focus, relaxation, clarity, persistence. I want to suggest that if we look more closely, I want to suggest a different set of qualities that we call on in doing this practice, and that, as you'll see, have a lot of applicability to acting. And the first one is a sense of accommodation. So when we sit down, and the question you asked me about thoughts, there's a quality of accommodating what's coming up. To the extent we can, we're not fighting, we're not excluding, we're accommodating everything. We're opening and allowing whatever comes up to come up, and we see it. The second quality is curiosity. So when a thought comes up, again, as we were talking about, you don't just, I'm not supposed to be thinking. You have some curiosity, you look at it, you feel it, you see the texture of it, or the quality of how your mind works. Oh my God, I didn't realize that I do that to myself all the time. There is a moment of interest, and you see the color, the texture of it, but then you don't engage further. And then not engaging further is a quality of daring, which is to say that when you come back to the breath, in that very instant, you're really allowing yourself not to be in control. I mean, it's a microsecond. You may not even notice it, but there's something very brave about coming back to the breath rather than turning on the TV or going to the refrigerator, because you don't know what's going to be there next in your sort of internal world. So there's a boldness and a daring in there. And then through all this, the quality of posture, we may be, if you look at a room full of meditators, everybody's sitting there, but some people are weeping inside, or some people are going through incredible traumas. Some people are totally spaced out. Anything could be going on, but you keep the posture, and that posture is a quality of steadfastness. You pretend that you have equanimity. That's what the posture is doing. But there's a sympathetic magic when you pretend. If you pretend long enough, it actually evokes it, because you have it naturally anyway. So you're twisted logic, but you're faking yourself out in a very good way here. So there's a accommodation, curiosity, daring, steadfastness, and then occasionally there's just that instant when you're meditating, and it may be very difficult, but all of a sudden there's a moment of freshness that comes from nowhere. There's a sense, it's called in the Shambhala tradition, the breeze of delight. All of a sudden things may be going on and on in your mind, and then there's just feels open, it feels delightful, it feels relaxed, which is a quality of letting go that happens by itself, but it has a feeling of joy. So these qualities, accommodation, curiosity, daring, steadfastness, and joy, we're not going to talk about how they apply to action. And this doesn't have to be, by the way, from the perspective of long-time meditators. We're going to talk about our own actual experience. So I want to talk about real challenges, and I want you to think of a big challenge that you have had or currently have that has to do with decision-making and acting in a way that's challenging for you, maybe shaky. I mean, it could be the need to have a tough conversation with your boss, with a partner, with a friend. It could be an over-your-head work assignment. It could be that you begin to realize you need a new life, a big life change, or a new career move. Anything like that. We all have these things. So if you would just keep in mind your own experience here, it can be a particular thing, or maybe this will evoke your patterns of how you relate. And this is really what we're going to talk about, is noticing the patterns of how we relate to that, to action, and seeing how further mindfulness of action can be helpful. So when we talk about action, every action, we can say quite safely, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Maybe hard to find the end because everything bleeds into everything else, but for the sake of discussion, we're going to talk about a particular sequence in time. Beginning, middle, and end. And we're going to call the beginning entering, and the middle is actually acting, doing whatever it is you're going to do, and the end is letting go. But between entering and acting, you've got to figure out when and where and what you're going to do. And so that part we call exploring. And then once you've acted, between acting and letting go, you're going to deal with the consequences of what you've set in motion. And so that part we're calling completing. So this is what I want to look at. 5 stages of any action. Entering, which starts the moment you have a challenge or an opportunity or an idea that sets you in motion. The moment you get a phone call and you think, oh crap, now I've got to something. Or the moment you wake up and you think, oh, I really should. Or the moment somebody throws a challenge at you, that's when you enter. And then so you enter, exploring, acting, completing, and letting go. So I'm going to play with a few examples, but the more important one is the ones you have in your head. And see how this informs them or not. So let's say in the morning you wake up and you have that feeling like you had a dream or you just slept funny and you think, oh God, I realize that my life just isn't working the way it is. I've got to change something. That could be every morning, you know. But let's say it's got a particular, more specific, powerful thing to it. And you realize you really have to make some decisions. And it might be about like a career change. I want to give an office example, which probably doesn't relate for many of you, but I'm too attached to the example because I've been using it for so long. I really like it because it brings up some other things. So the example is that you're working in an office, you're at a reasonably high level, and you get an assignment. And the assignment says, we want you to go to this branch office we have. They're completely screwed up. We have no idea what's going on. You have to sort it out. And you can fire people or hire people, up to you. And let's say that for you, this is like, the good news is, wow, this is a lot of responsibility. And the bad news is the same thing. You feel totally over your head. Okay, so even before we start off in the situation, there needs to be some kind of clear intention. So what the intention I want to work with here, because we're talking in the context of a mindfulness practice, not making America safe for Donald Trump, is that the intention is that you're going to try to be of benefit. You're going to try to be honest and authentic with what it is you're dealing with and be of benefit to the people involved. And so that brings along a sense that you can learn. You need to learn from the situation. You're not coming in already knowing exactly what to do, but you need to learn and you're willing to learn. Okay, so that's all we're starting with. So what happens when this challenge or opportunity arises is something moves in us. We get stirred up. We get excited. We get freaked out. And when things get stirred up, there's always 2 aspects of us that react: our intelligence and our habits. Let's call them our intelligence and our neurosis. Both are stirred up. So The result is, in the moment of entering a situation, the moment of receiving a challenge, you're unlikely to be seeing things completely clearly. So at that point, the first thing to do, which we so often miss, is to do nothing. In other words, the first thing to do in entering is to pause, to make sure we're not being reactive. Doing nothing mainly internally, in other words, not jumping to conclusions. This is where the famous, advice of take a deep breath comes in. But it's really taking a deep breath psychologically. Physically can also help. Because our emotions and fears can be quite riled up. And when we stop, when we take a deep breath or whatever, if we're doing it properly, or honestly, I should say, what we'll notice is the enormous amount of stuff going on inside us. Just like we've been talking in sitting practice, when you begin to stop, you see how busy your mind is. Same thing, particularly when we're now entering the situation. We begin to see, what do we see? We see our own preconceptions. We see our own fears. We see our own biases. We're ready to fight, or we're ready to give up, roll over and play dead. Whatever our habit is, we notice that there's some kind of response this is calling out of us. So the challenge in entering is to notice your own preconceptions and filters, which is not that easy to do. How do you know something that's coming up in your mind is a habit or a preconception? Well, you learn to know because it's got a very familiar habitual feel. You begin to feel you're reacting in the same old way, and we all have our patterns. Think about if you go to a place where there's a lot of people you don't know, like a party. How do you react? What's your pattern? Are you seductive and out there? Do you kind of hide in the corner? Do you mentally dismiss everyone else and find reasons why, whatever, you can put them down? There are many different styles of doing this, but all of us have kind of habits we call forth when there's a challenge or when things are unknown. And the challenge when you enter a situation is not to get caught by the habit, because then you won't be able to see where you're going. And that happens very, very often. So the idea here is to look, listen, be available. And it takes a lot, because we're in a fraught situation. What's the barrier to just seeing things clearly? It's fear. It can be all kinds of fears. It can be fears of specific outcomes. It can be fears of failure, fears of embarrassment, fears of exposure, fears that we're inadequate, we're going to be seen for the inadequate person we really are, which almost every human being, by the way, has that fear, in case anybody's not aware of that. All sorts of things. So all through this, talking about action, there is a kind of theme of fearlessness. That's very important, because fear is our main barrier. And as we sit with fear in meditation practice, we begin to realize how ungrounded most of it is. I mean, we have stories. We all have stories that justify why we're afraid or can't do this or can't do that. And when you begin to sort of do the practice of not seeing your stories but not going along with them, they begin to get a little flimsy. So the advice about fear is to smile at it and invite it, and basically say, you can come along or not, I'm going ahead. Or another way of saying it is just, hold the fear in one hand and just keep walking forward. So the problem with fear also is we're afraid to show our fear to others. It's culturally completely inappropriate. I have found my own experience that when I've seen people give talks like mindfulness, meditation, or related subjects, and I could see their fear and their trembling, those are almost invariably the most powerful experiences of listening to somebody, because it kind of draws out the vulnerability in everybody else. It's an act of enormous generosity to show that to other people. So, in the personal example, you wake up and you think, oh, I think I need to change my job. And then voice comes up and said, that's impossible. It'll never work. Every time you come up with an idea like this, it's all, I always fail. So the entering part is actually hearing that and seeing it without reacting to it. And otherwise, what might happen is we just immediately have an inspiration and then become discouraged, and we're not sure why. In my own life, I've had the experience maybe 3 or 4 times that when something has been offered to me, and I have been usually I'm not that definitive, but the few times I've been really definitive that absolutely this isn't going to work, each time that was a thing that worked. And when I said no, most strongly, that became indicator to me that I better do this. So it's good to sort of figure that out in one's own life. So in this work example I gave, you come into this new situation, you arrive at this office, you walk in there, and you're very shaky. You don't know what you're walking into. You feel, I don't know if I can handle this. But you just walk in there and you don't do anything at the beginning. You just hang out and you let people come to you. And the magic of this kind of approach is all these people are freaked out themselves because they know here's somebody coming to check them out, and everybody's nervous. But when you're calm, everyone else calms down. So that kind of quality of pausing has a very powerful effect on others and also internally on your own sort of competing agendas. So entering, doing nothing. Doing nothing doesn't mean not doing anything literally. It means not doing anything extra. Just give the situation space. Feel you're nervous, you're uncertain. Let it be that way for a bit. It's the hardest thing to do of all the things we're going to talk about. And it's the most important because if you don't do it properly, you're off on one foot. And one of the classic examples of this is what's called the ready, fire, aim syndrome, or fire, aim, ready, which is ready is what we're talking about. But if you look, for instance, at the U.S. going to war in Iraq, great example. Just first act, then think about it, and then see what the consequences are. I read an interesting thing the other day that said, I'm not going to spend much time in military analogies, but it said that there was a study in, I think it might be Canadian military intelligence, but it was military intelligence that showed that people given the proper information after they got wrong information and based their positions on wrong information, when they got proper information, they only hardened the wrong positions. It didn't change their mind. So it's that notion that the most important thing is get off on the right foot. Don't, as much as you can, don't get caught by your patterns. So anybody who works for an organization, particularly if I may say a government bureaucracy, probably could spend days giving examples of this sort of stuff. And we all have it in our lives from personal misunderstandings. We've gone on a long misunderstanding with a friend or ex-friend and then realized that we had made some assumption that we never looked at, sort of the whole thing. Does that make sense? Any questions? We'll pause for a moment for questions if you have any.
one of the time I work alone. One of the jobs that I'm in healthcare. So you're kind of saying, now, what am I going to do here? And I really can't do that. And then you say, oh yes, I can. So what's that like? You're stepping over another line, saying, I'm not looking at that fear, but I'm looking at I've got to keep going. Got to step ahead.
Well, in that sense, you are stepping ahead with the fear.
With the fear
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
I have that fear. It's not going to go away,
Yeah.
but I'm saying I have to do it
Absolutely.
anyway.
Yeah. So the question you can ask yourself here as you get into situations, did I stop? Did I pause and notice my preconceptions before I got in? Okay, so we've stopped for a moment, paused, the challenge has been laid down, and the question is, now what? What do we do? How do we figure out what we're going to do, when and where and how to act? And this is where curiosity is the key. And again, curiosity in this case is a natural quality. Curiosity comes out of not being possessed by fear. It's a natural quality of human beings. And what dampens it is fearfulness. So other words that we use for it is engaging, appreciative, inquisitive. Again, it's that quality in the meditation practice where you notice the color and the texture and the feeling of what's coming up in your mind. And fear in this case, in the exploring stage, is often fear that if we look at the situation honestly, it's going to be too demanding. If we look at the situation honestly, if we look at, well, let me look at my life and my career, we're going to see things we don't really want to see. It's going to bring up stuff that's going to be demanding of skills we feel we don't have. Better to sort of not look too closely. And very often, this stage is about proving our assumptions or prejudices. When people say we're going to investigate the situation, often they already have the answer. And often it's just doing a little cursory looking around to satisfy others and yourself that, oh yeah, I looked into it, but really you never did. Really you knew what you wanted to do from the beginning, which was your habitual reaction. So for instance, if this idea comes up and you say to yourself, geez, I can never change what I'm doing, but I guess I better look at it. You manage to look at a few things that just prove to you that you can't do it. That's not exploration. In fact, I want to suggest, and this does not come from mindfulness teaching, but more the leadership work I've been doing, but there's at least 4 different ways of knowing about something, of looking at situations and we explore. And most of us tend to favor 1 or maybe 2, and maybe think the rest are flaky or useless. So we have like the analytical side and the intuition side. And the analytically chauvinistic people think that the intuition is just woo-woo, you know. And the intuition people think that analytical is soul-destroying and has destroyed the world already. Now, interesting thing is there's been a lot of surveys that have shown that most CEOs make business decisions based on intuition. And so that's a whole nother discussion we don't have time for, but the fact that a lot of the analytical work is more of a ritual for inviting intuition than it actually is figuring anything out. But let's talk a little bit about this. So when we talk about analysis, it means really looking at parts, looking at details, taking a situation apart as finely as you can and looking at the details and trying to learn from that. So, you know, making lists, it can be, okay, if I want to look at changing my career, I make a list of pros and cons, for instance. Or in business, there's millions of examples. You make critical path analysis, SWOT analysis, pro formas, so on and so forth. So this has been incredibly useful. This is what's given us science, engineering, and technology, this kind of analysis. But it doesn't work so well on living situations. And if you take 3 parts of a machine and put them together, you know what's going to happen. But if you put 3 people together, you have no idea, actually. And so there's another kind of way of looking at things, which is looking at things systemically, where you're looking more at the whole. How does the whole work together? How are things interconnected? How do they work in context? And you realize that you can't learn about how a whole thing works from its parts if it's alive. I mean, we could dissect, somebody could volunteer here to be dissected, which would be a great act of generosity, fearlessness. And we say, okay, there's a liver, 2 kidneys, 2 lungs, a brain, and try to figure out the function of each. And then, imagine from that what the person is like. That's not so helpful, right? So, practically speaking, the fact that things don't work like a machine, but like a living system, is why we so often have unintended consequences. But we make a great plan, or the government comes up with some fantastic plan, or the organization does, and then lo and behold, the plans never work, and all kinds of other strange things happen. Well, that's why we have to look at things more, how they work together. And a very important part of doing that, now practically for us, is if there are people involved, talking to the people, engaging, listening to the people in a system. And for yourself, it's noticing your own parts, understanding your history of how you react, looking at the context. So not looking at just isolated bits of yourself, but saying, okay, is this a habitual reaction I'm having now? Is it really work that I need to change, or something else going on with me? So that's a systemic way of looking at things. And in the office example, when you go to this place to figure out what's going on, you talk to people. You look at all the plans and the personnel analysis and the budget versus actuals, but that's not going to tell you very much, except point you in a direction. Then you start engaging people. Okay, that's the analysis side. Now we have the intuition side. And one of them is knowing with the body, gut instinct. And there's actually very interesting ways of developing that capability based on the notion that in your body you pretty much remember everything. And it's got a much more sophisticated way of processing than the analytical mind does. So we usually when we do workshops on this, we teach this. It's called focusing. But it could be the kind of thing you could say to yourself, okay, so I've decided I have to quit my job. Now, let me sit here and imagine I quit my job. Like, just imagine I did it. I walked in the office and I said it. And then see, how do you feel? How's that feeling in you? Is all of a sudden, do you have like a neck ache? Or your stomach is turning over? So it's paying attention to ourselves in a slightly more subtle level than we often do, and realizing that our body is full of information if we are patient enough to sit with it and listen to it. And the same thing in a work situation. You go in, you talk to people, and nothing much is coming through, and you're sitting with a sense that you haven't been talking to the right people. It's not logical, but something in you feels like you've got to do something different. Now, there's another type of intuition, and that's an intuition where your attention isn't internal in your body, but it's in the environment. And this is difficult to talk about. It involves things like synchronicity and pattern recognition, and the fact that very often, it's funny coincidences that set us off in one direction or another. The notion is the world is one whole thing, and it's worth paying attention to details. And by the way, this is the principle that almost any traditional way of, I don't want to use the word fortune telling, but I guess predicting, prognostication, almost any culture. Some people look at chicken bones, or they look at the waves on the water, or whatever. And, you know, some of us can laugh at that and say, that's totally ridiculous, except it strangely often works. And it's simply the notion that your mind is much bigger than you think it is, and there's millions of things you could notice. And so what you choose to notice can have some relation to what's going on. So the idea is looking at details and noticing what it brings up in you and taking it with a grain of salt at the same time. So for example, here you are wondering whether you should leave your job, and by total coincidence, you run into two old friends in the same week, both who have happily left their jobs. Does that kind of thing ever happen to anybody? Yeah, I mean, it happens all the damn time, actually, but usually we don't pay attention because it's not culturally appropriate, and it's kind of beneath our analytical, you know, arrogance, but it works. So in this case, in the office, you know, all of a sudden you notice a few times you walk down the hall and this person has jumped out at you standing by the Xerox machine. Not because you're sexually attracted, but just because there's something about them. And you have a hunch, I think I'll talk to them. They're on another team entirely. And of course, they say to you, oh, everyone knows what's going on with those people. It's so-and-so that's coming up the works. So those things, so in the exploration stage, what I want to suggest is, first of all, my being curious. Because if you're not curious, you're just trying to prove something you've already decided. You're not really open and exploring. And am I using all the ways of knowing that are available to me? There's a point where I want to break into small groups and discuss it, but I think I'm going to go 5 more minutes and we're going to have a little break. Is that okay? Any questions about this? Am I losing anybody in
I just didn't understand that last sentence. Say that last sentence again.
about breaking to small groups?
No. About the knowing part. Can you say that?
Oh, about using all the ways of knowing?
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that if you're inclined to do things completely on feel and intuition, it might be helpful for you to actually write up a list of pros and cons. And if you're inclined to sort of, you know, I want to see the numbers, and usually, well, we don't know who's here, but if that's your approach, it could be helpful to pay attention to your body as well. Because all of those things are all equally potent. They look at different parts of the terrain, but they're all illuminating all those 4 ways of knowing. Analyzing, you know, breaking things down, looking at context, looking at how things interact, looking at systems, feeling in the body, and then just noticing what's going on around you and what it's evoking in your mind. All those are very powerful. Now we're wired in certain ways. So some of these things are going to be second nature and some are going to seem odd. So not suggesting we should do them all equally, but it'd be interesting to experiment a bit. Okay, so we're exploring, we're delving into it, we're engaging in curiosity, fear's coming up. At some point, the observation time is over. There's clarity and it's time to act. And how do we know what the right time to do that is? Big question, because timing is critical. And I want to suggest there's 2 ways of knowing. One is you have actual clarity. Boom, aha, I see it, I know it, feels right, this is the way to go. Or you have hesitation, but a particular kind of hesitation. you keep on hesitating in a similar way, which means that you actually know what to do, you just don't want to do it. So there's a difference between intelligent doubt and hesitation. And this is a place where a lot of us, particularly who are people who feel more on the reflective end of the scale than the action end of the scale, where a lot of us get caught up. There's also a difference between being spontaneous, acting spontaneously, and being reactive and impulsive. And those are the challenges in going into action, to actually feel the difference between those. The reason it's so difficult for many of us to act or move from having an insight to acting is that it's a completely different kind of energy. We're going from curiosity to daring. And in the first stage of accommodating curiosity, there's a quality of saying yes to the world. We're letting it all come in as much as we can. We're opening, we're noticing, we're being receptive. We're not doing a lot except delving further. When it comes to acting, you've decided on one thing. It's almost as if you're going from saying yes to saying no. No to anything other than that one thing you've decided on. All the other options are closed at the moment of action. And that's tough. Some of us are much better at saying yes than no. But we've got to learn to be, ambidextrous if we want to act effectively. Because the next sections have a lot to do with no. And you're declaring yourself. It's a very fraught situation. You're putting a stake in the ground, so to speak. And there's no certainty. There's no guarantees. There's no such thing as the complete information that makes the whole thing absolutely certain. So that's why it's called daring. And also in the first stages where you're just bringing things in, it can be very collaborative. If you're working in an organizational problem, a work problem, you're engaging people, maybe you're having groups that work together to think of solutions, working in teams. But at the moment of decision and action, it's very alone. So all of your teammates can't be there in your mind at that point. So because of that, action is very fraught. It's very raw. It's very exposing. And we get inelegant with it as a result. And again, in the mindfulness practice, it's that moment of going back to the breath. A very little microcosm of that. So how do we hesitate unintelligently? There's many ways to hold back from acting. We want to make sure that we have all the information. We want to accomplish the whole vision at once. We want to have everybody on board. We want to do it perfectly. We don't want to make any mistakes. Does any of that sound familiar to anybody? And organizationally, it gets us into what's called paralysis through analysis. And personally as well. So that those are the ways, all of those are expressions of fear. At a certain point. At some point, your doubt is very intelligent, but when you reach these kind of visions of perfection that guarantees you want before you act, then it's fear. Now that makes us act too late. Too early, we act too early because we're impulsive and reactive, and we can't stand the uncertainty. It's nervousness. So both of those are based with fear. And again, the advice of the traditions is go with your fear, walk forward with your fear and trembling, and here we have to trust ourselves and take a leap. And at the moment of leaping, it's just us and ourselves doing it. We're just with ourselves. So there's a sense of trust. Because we can't be looking over our shoulder as we're leaping. So we're going to leap into something we don't want. So when you act boldly and honestly and directly, all kinds of things happen. Some are supportive and some are challenging. And I want to read you something that's attributed to the German philosopher and poet Goethe, although he didn't actually write this. But that's what it says on the internet. It's quite lovely, though. It was written by a Scottish mountaineer in the early 20th century. So it goes like this. Until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans. That the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings and material assistance, which no man could have dreamed would have come his way. Whatever you can do or dream you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Begin it now. That's the good news part of it. So the question at this stage of acting is basically you could ask yourself, am I giving into impulse or am I caught in hesitation? Those are the questions that may help you in terms of timing. And again, you know, I need more information. I'm not quite ready. I know I've got this urge, but it keeps on coming back, but I don't have all the things. That's hesitation. And impulse often is, God, it's driving me crazy. I got to do something now. Both of those are unlikely to be effective actions that come out of that. Okay. What should we do? Well, how about this? Let's take 12 minutes, and I'd like you to break off in twos. And let me briefly review. We have the entering, about the pausing, the engaging, curiosity, and exploring and curiosity, and engaging different ways, and now acting, which is a sense of seeing your hesitation or impulse and then just taking a leap. So maybe think in terms of your own life, own challenges. You don't have to get, be very personal, but just think of the dynamics of it. And please have a conversation in twos and see what questions or insights come up for you. And then we'll have a little general conversation after that. So please just turn to your neighbor or find a neighbor or hook a neighbor. Jim? Is that making sense, David?
Oh, it's wonderful.